Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. For a lot of people, the gaming monitor I'm looking at today has been a long time coming. It was first shown off at Computex 2017. It was then delayed repeatedly, and finally, in the middle of 2019, it will be available to buyers shortly. I'm of course talking about the Asus ROG Swift PG35VQ. You've all seen the title of this video, and boy, is there a lot of content to fit into this review. So, to start with, the PG35VQ is one of several designs, along with an Acer and AOC model, that's based off a new super high-end ultra-wide HDR capable panel from AU Optronics. The specs are extremely impressive, a 35-inch 3440 by 1440 curved VA panel at up to 200 Hz. For starters, that's a significant increase on the refresh rate capabilities of these 1440p class ultrawides, and then on top of that, we're getting proper HDR functionality through a 512 zone full array local dimming backlight, 1000 nits of peak brightness, and 90% DCI-P3 coverage, and the cherry on top is G-Sync Ultimate support. All of that comes at an enormous price tag. Asus wouldn't confirm exactly how much this will cost in the US or Australia, given it's still a few weeks away from launching officially, but it is up for pre-order in the UK for £2,700, which would put it in the $2,500 to $3,000 US range when you account for tax. So yeah, certainly quite a pricey monitor. But before that, this video is brought to you by Raid Shadow Legends, the latest hero collector role-playing game that you can play on your phone right now for free. It has an amazing storyline, awesome 3D graphics, seriously check out the level of detail on these characters, plus there are giant boss fights and more than 400 champions for you to collect and customize. This game reminds me a lot of classic RPGs and strategy games, plus it's growing fast and is expected to receive a huge update this month, which will add even more fun for new players. With a 4.6 star rating on the Play Store from over 150,000 reviews, this is the best time to join the action. So what are you waiting for? Click the links in the description below and you'll instantly get 50,000 silver and a free epic champion as part of the new player program to start your journey. So now, let's get back to the video. Anyway, lots to cover here, so let's get into the basics. The design is very similar to Asus's previous ROG Swift designs, and once again, not a huge fan personally. I prefer a more sleek and minimalist aesthetic. Asus has historically gone with these more heavy gamer designs. I get why they do it, but the crazy patterns on the back and copper highlights on the stand just don't really get me excited. RGB is still present here. You get a large Asus ROG logo on the back, a projected light that comes out the bottom of the stand, and an additional light in the top of the stand. A lot of these elements you won't see in standard operation, or you can just disable it like I did. Build quality, again, standard for Asus. The stand is very sturdy and uses metal for the legs, but the rest of the housing is just basic plastic in a few different textures. I am happy that the bezel size is a lot smaller than the previous 27-inch G-Sync Ultimate displays though. There's a decent amount of functionality here. The stand supports height, tilt, and swivel adjustment as you'd expect from a premium monitor. There's also VESA mounting compatibility if you need it. For ports, you get HDMI 2.0 and DisplayPort 1.4. You should be using DisplayPort here. Plus there's a 2-port USB hub and a 3.5mm audio output jack. The on-screen display is controlled through a directional toggle for the most part, and there's a lot of features in here. To access the 200 Hz mode, you have to enable that in here. The monitor ships with a default max refresh rate of 180 Hz, so that's something to keep in mind. Then there's a number of color controls, backlight controls, HDR features, and so on that I'll mention throughout the review, plus gamer-specific features like cheat crosshairs, FPS counters, and more. Everything you're used to with an Asus ROG monitor. Like the Asus PG35VQ and other similar G-Sync Ultimate monitors, the PG35VQ does require active cooling. There's a small fan built into an area near the inputs, but it's noticeably quieter than the fans that shipped with the PG35VQ. Instead of being audible almost all the time, the PG35VQ is basically silent. You will hear the fan in a very quiet room, but in most conditions it will be drowned out by other noise, and to be honest, it's basically a non-issue unless you must have a silent room. Let's move into performance now, and obviously one of the big features here is the 200 Hz refresh rate, which is a first for 3440 by 1440 ultrawides. Previously, the cap for these monitors was 144 Hz. You can get that with monitors from LG and soon MSI for around $1,000. But for some, 144 Hz may not be future-proof enough. So now we have 200 Hz available in this monitor. The good news is DisplayPort 1.4 has enough bandwidth for 3440 by 1440 at 200Hz with 8-bit color. This is in stark contrast to the 27-inch 4K 144Hz HDR panels, which were capped to 120Hz with 8-bit color and needed chroma subsampling at 144Hz. There's really no need for chroma subsampling at all with the PG35VQ, and you can happily use this in an SDR configuration at 200Hz. For HDR gaming, the bandwidth limit for uncompressed 10-bit HDR at 3440 by 1440 is 144Hz. Above that, say you want to play HDR games at 200Hz, you have one of two options. You could use chroma subsampling, or you could drop down the monitor to 8-bit color with HDR, which is the default behavior here. Now you might be thinking, hang on a moment, don't you need 10-bit color for HDR? And the answer is kinda yes and kinda no. While 10-bit color is one of the improvements HDR is designed to make over SDR and is part of the HDR10 standard, there's actually nothing stopping you from dropping down to 8-bit while maintaining HDR support with a wide color gamut and increased contrast. 10-bit color merely increases the number of colors to 1.07 billion and helps smooth out gradients to reduce banding, but it isn't a requirement for any other aspect of HDR video. For the most part, a 10-bit source can be shrunk down to 8-bit with minimal quality loss. I tried many games in the HDR mode with both 8-bit and 10-bit color and really couldn't notice any differences whatsoever. In fact, in games that did have some color banding with gradients, that banding was still present in the 10-bit mode. Given the panel itself is still a native 8-bit panel with FRC for 10-bit support, I don't think there's a significant downside to running this display at 8-bit HDR at 200Hz. That said, your mileage may vary, especially for HDR films, which is a bit of a different story to games, and if you do notice some gradient banding, it could be worth dropping down to 144Hz to gain 10-bit color support. For me though, the simplest solution is to run the monitor at 200Hz with 8-bit color, whether I was in the SDR or HDR modes. The visual quality was excellent and far better than what you get if chroma subsampling was required. In fact, I'm stoked that you can use the full capabilities of this panel without having to mess around with subsampling. As for 200Hz itself, to my eyes, it is a big step up from 100Hz in terms of smoothness, and a lesser but still somewhat noticeable step up from 144Hz. The main question is whether you have the GPU horsepower to drive games at this resolution and refresh rate. As of today, with an RTX 2080 Ti, you can get 150 to 200 FPS in games like Fortnite and other less intensive esports-ish titles, but with big AAA games on ultra settings, 100 FPS is a more realistic target. Of course, you can tweak the settings for better performance, but this is with the 2080 Ti. Anyone with a lower tier GPU will face an uphill battle to even hit above 144 FPS. That said, upgrade cycles for monitors are long, so having something that does 200Hz now is going to be right at the top of the market for years to come and will let you enjoy many new GPU upgrades without maxing out the capabilities of your monitor. I feel this sort of future-proofing is more the goal of offering 200Hz now, which makes sense given the enormous cost of this display. And as it supports G-Sync Ultimate, of course you will get a smooth experience if your frame rates are well below 200 FPS. So with chroma subsampling a non-issue with this monitor, the next question is whether this VA panel is actually capable of a 200Hz refresh rate. Given response times tend to be an issue with VAs, I was super curious to see whether AU Optronics could deliver the required sub 5.0 millisecond response times for a true 200Hz experience. Before showing you the numbers, response times are a really interesting situation with this panel. As this monitor has an FALD backlight, response times are actually governed by two aspects: the response time of the liquid crystals, which is the usual determining factor for overall response times, as well as the response of the backlight. And this is crucial because the PG35VQ has different response behavior depending on whether the dynamic backlight is enabled or disabled. With the FALD backlight enabled, the best overdrive mode to use is extreme. With this mode enabled, there are some good benefits. Overshoot is well managed and often non-existent, and there's not much dark level smearing from very slow dark transition times. However, the FALD backlight's fall time is a little slow on the tail end in some instances, which pushes out some transition times. Overall though, the average graded grade transition is 6.09 milliseconds, a little shy of the 5 millisecond target, but considering more than half of the overall transitions measured were within that window, some as fast as 2 milliseconds, I'd say this is borderline capable of 200Hz and fine for 144Hz. With the FALD backlight disabled, the best overdrive mode to use is normal, as the extreme mode introduces far too much overshoot with the dynamic backlight off. It seems the extreme mode has been specifically tweaked to work well in tandem with the FALD backlight, which I guess makes sense as most users will leave it enabled for gaming. Without the FALD backlight impacting the tail end of transitions, this combination of settings has a faster greater gray average of 4.55 milliseconds, which is perfect for 200 Hz. However, dark level smearing is worse in this mode than if you leave the FALD backlight on with extreme overdrive. It also has more overshoot in general, although not to a severe extent. So there's pros and cons to each scenario. I think most gamers will leave the dynamic backlight enabled for non-HDR gaming, in which case extreme is the better choice and 200 Hz is borderline achievable. For most users this will be fine, and with this combination, ghosting, smearing or inverse ghosting isn't much of an issue despite being a VA panel. Input lag results were excellent. I measured these numbers with the dynamic backlight and G-Sync enabled, and with under 3.0 milliseconds of latency, this monitor is in line with other gaming grade panels I've tested. Let's talk a bit about the backlight now. There's 512 individual zones across this 35-inch panel, which is enough for a solid HDR experience. Compared to the 27-inch HDR monitors with 384 zones, each zone is a bit larger with the ultrawide, but this is mitigated by the use of VA technology instead of IPS. Haloing is still present, but it's less noticeable when the monitor is viewed from in front. It can look a bit worse at off angles due to the middling viewing angles of VA panels, but in most use cases, the FALD backlight works better here than in the PG35VQ due to high native contrast. For gaming and video playback in almost all scenarios, it's impossible to notice the FALD backlight in action, especially when set to the fastest mode, which is lightning quick. However, it's a mixed bag for productivity. When viewing large areas of solid colors, you can often spot haloing as the white mouse cursor moves around. My recommendation is to leave the backlight enabled for SDR gaming and general usage, unless the haloing bothers you, in which case you should disable it for productivity work. The HDR experience from this monitor is outstanding. As of today, I'd say this monitor delivers the best HDR experience of any monitor on the market, including the older 27-inch 4K panels. It's not as good as modern TVs, which have the benefit of more mature HDR technology, but for monitors, this is as good as it gets. First up is the checklist. Every box is ticked here, so it's a true HDR panel. The color space is wider than SDR with 90% DCI-P3 coverage. In my testing, it was a little under this, but close enough. Brightness hits over 1000 nits peak, and of course, we have the high zone count FALD backlight, which provides much better contrast than SDR monitors. Digging a little deeper on the brightness, behavior here is outstanding. 840 nits sustained in a full white window is higher than the PG27VQ, and you get 1000 nits at 50%, which then increases to around 1060 nits at 25% or lower. This panel has a better and more powerful backlight that can be utilized up to 1000 nits in more conditions. On top of 840 nits peak, it is still capable of a 1100 nit white flash across the entire display, which certainly is eye-scorching. Black levels push the tools at my disposal to the limit. The best I can say here is that the contrast ratio is at least 100,000 to 1 in the HDR mode, which again is higher than the G-Sync Ultimate monitors that use IPS panels. So combined with excellent brightness, you get excellent contrast, exactly the intention of HDR displays. There are also far more HDR capable games these days compared to last year when I first checked out the PG27VQ. Both Windows 10 and the games themselves are slowly improving how they handle HDR, and many titles look absolutely spectacular when viewed on a proper HDR monitor like this. The experience is a lot better than standard SDR in these games and is quite hard to capture on camera. It's something you have to see for yourself, especially beside an SDR display. With better depth, better contrast, and better colors, games look truly amazing on the PG35VQ. How about SDR performance? Well, brightness is capped at around 500 nits, whether the FALD backlight is enabled or disabled. With the dynamic backlight disabled, native contrast is around 2280 to 1, which is weak for a VA, but typical for AU Optronics technology. That said, given the FALD backlight increases the contrast ratio to over 25,000 to 1 at 200 nits, it's a bit of a non-issue. The PG35VQ does come with some degree of factory calibration, and Asus has done a lot of things right here out of the box. There is an SDR mode gamut switch in the monitor's OSD, which defaults to sRGB, but can be switched to wide gamut if you need it for DCI-P3 work. I'm not going to touch on DCI-P3 performance here in detail, but it's about as accurate as the sRGB mode. sRGB performance is decent out of the box. Grayscale performance is really the only weak point, and even then it's still very good for a gaming class display, with a Delta E average of 2.37 and serviceable CCT and gamma performance. The white point of around 6300K is close to being accurate. Saturation performance is strong. A Delta E average of 1.62 is close to the results Asus provides on their calibration sheet that comes in the box. Color checker results are also good, with a Delta E average of 1.76, and again you get similar sub 2.0 Delta E averages in the wide gamut mode when measuring against DCI P3. Interestingly, accuracy actually decreases if you disable the FALD backlight. It seems Asus has optimized this monitor for FALD usage, which makes sense given you probably should be using it in most circumstances. Delta E averages push to above 2.0 with default settings with the FALD backlight disabled. It's a small change, but it's one worth noting. It is possible to correct things further with a software ICC profile and some small OSD tweaks, but I'm not going to discuss that in detail given Delta E performance is already below 2.0 out of the box. It's not quite at the level of a professional display, but for gamers, this sort of performance is excellent and isn't worth the hassle of software profiles. Uniformity with the FALD backlight enabled is excellent as well, especially for a curved VA ultrawide panel, which tend to be weaker in this area. Center performance is great with sub 2.0 Delta E's across pretty much the entire central zone. It's only on the outer edges where things fall away somewhat, which is typical. For a backlight with 512 individual zones, this is a fabulous result and gives a generally uniform image. So that's all the performance data in. Obviously lots to talk about, so time to run over just my general thoughts on this monitor. First up, I'm really happy to see that a number of issues that were present with the first generation of G-Sync Ultimate displays like the Asus PG35VQ have been resolved or somewhat mitigated with the PG35VQ. Not having to mess around with chroma subsampling at the highest refresh rate is a huge bonus, and although you are restricted to 8-bit color depth above 144Hz, even for HDR gaming, this was basically a non-issue in my testing. The use of VA technology along with the FALD backlight has reduced haloing. It is still there, but it's better than first-gen IPS panels, and it also brings with it better overall contrast. And the fan, while still present, is less obnoxious than with the original monitors. I was also pleased to see that 200Hz is a viable refresh rate for this panel. Response times vary depending on the configuration you go with, but with the FALD backlight enabled, which I think most people opt to use at all times for gaming, 200Hz is borderline doable without much dark level smearing. With the FALD backlight disabled, you can get well within the 200Hz barrier, but with worse dark level smearing and overshoot, so it just depends what you're after. Overall, considering the known limitations of VA technology, this is a better than expected result. Other areas of performance are also top-notch. There's excellent input latency even in the HDR mode, superb HDR brightness levels, decent out-of-the-box calibration with support for both sRGB and wide gamut modes, a great array of OSD features, very good uniformity, and an adjustable stand. When looking across all areas of this monitor, it has to be the best I've tested and the best on the market today. It combines a high resolution that's well suited to gaming with a top-end refresh rate and throws in true HDR performance into the mix with few issues and performance to back it up. It's better than the 27-inch 4K 144Hz G-Sync Ultimate monitors in my opinion, although obviously it's a different format display so it won't appeal to everyone. The only thing it's really missing is a 4K class resolution, but to pair that with the rest of these specs is well beyond today's technology. The main issue here is going to be the price. This is a premium monitor and it shows with a premium price tag of what I'm assuming will be near the $3,000 mark, certainly above $2,500 US going on UK pricing. It will likely end up $1,000 more expensive than the 27-inch 4K G-Sync Ultimate monitors, if not more, which will keep this entirely in the range of buyers with deep pockets and high-end systems to match. Looking at the entire display ecosystem today, with this monitor priced at say $3,000, I just feel it's not great value even though you're getting the best on the market. It's an extremely high price tag, so high that for the same money, you could get a very nice 55-inch LG C9 OLED TV plus a high refresh ultrawide gaming monitor. To me, I think a reasonable price would be $1,500 to $2,000 US, which is obviously a huge price cut from what it will actually cost. My reasoning here is that you can buy a monitor like the LG 34GK950F right now for about $1,000, which offers a 3440 by 1440 resolution at 144Hz without much HDR capabilities. So I think adding $500 to $1,000 to the price for a higher refresh rate and proper HDR sounds fair. Unfortunately, it will likely be 3 times the price when it hits the market in a few weeks, and that will push it out of reach of even those with high-end 2080 Ti gaming rigs. If you're buying a $3,000 monitor, you're probably going to be the sort of person that has a spare 2080 Ti in case their current 2080 Ti dies. You know, the kind of person that would spend $3,000 without blinking an eye. Hopefully the price drops in the next few years for this technology, because the tech here is super exciting and I'd love to see it in the hands of more enthusiasts at a more reasonable price. That's it for this review of the Asus ROG Swift PG35VQ. I'm also hoping to check out the Acer Predator and AOC Aegon variants when they hit the market, but it sounds like they're a bit behind Asus in getting these panels out. Subscribe for more monitor content, consider supporting us on Patreon, and I'll catch you in the next one.